story name, Secrets of the Depth, shared by Rising Mac. As a criminal psychologist, I've encountered an incredible range of explanations for people's actions. I don't care what outlandish reasons someone comes up with. If it's something that resonates with me, I'm inclined to believe it. Not because I think the person genuinely believes in the fantastical story they are telling, but because, despite any underlying mental health issues, there are times when I find myself taking them at face value. It's not about assuming an actual supernatural entity is involved or that the individual is simply delusional due to illness. As a psychologist, it's essential to approach these situations as if what they're claiming actually happened, even if it sounds ridiculous. However, there have been instances where my gut has told me otherwise. I've had a nagging feeling that this person isn't struggling with any mental health issues and might be telling the truth. I want to share with you the transcript from our interview. Before we begin, a bit about him. He's a highly educated professor holding PhDs in biology, anatomy, and pathology, and serves as chairman of the local university's biology department. There's no history of mental illness in his personal or family background that I'm aware of. Now, let's hear what he has to say for himself. Can I introduce myself? My name is Michael, and I'm here to share something with you that might be difficult to hear. To start from the beginning, a few days ago our school year ended, and we decided to take our annual camping trip together. It was just me, Dave, Gary, and John, all friends and colleagues in the biology department. We've been doing this trip every year for years. We head to Redacted Provincial Park in Canada, where we spend a few days camping at a campground, and then venture into a deep wilderness site that's only accessible by canoe. It's our favorite part of the trip. It's so remote, and we're usually completely alone. The trip started off well. We found a great spot in the backwoods, and things were looking good initially. I'm certified in scuba diving, and we had never explored this part of Redacted Lake before. The atmosphere was really wild. We were way out of our element. I was itching to dive in. As for the visibility, most lakes like this have pretty poor conditions. I've heard stories about how it's not exactly teeming with life underwater. But there's something about diving in a lake that few people ever visit. It's just so untouched by human activity. The water is cleaner, and you don't see all the trash and pollution that comes with more populated areas. I didn't get in the water until our second day. For me, the experience was just as much about being 30 feet underwater without seeing any trash or man-made objects around. It was pretty quiet and peaceful. To be honest, when I swam out a bit further towards the center of the lake, visibility was really poor at first. But then it slowly came into focus. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of propeller plane, but as soon as I realized it wasn't, I knew it was something else entirely. It was irregularly shaped and had this big shaft sticking up towards the surface, about 15 feet below the water. There was also what looked like a fin attached to it, probably around that height. I swam closer to what I thought was the front of the craft and saw some kind of rounded section on top. It had a broken window in it, so you couldn't see inside. Based on its unusual design, I immediately suspected that this wasn't any normal man-made object. It looked almost like something out of science fiction. I didn't want to jump to conclusions about whether or not it was actually an alien spacecraft without getting some more information. Luckily, John was a diver too and had brought his own tank equipment. We decided he should come down with me to take a closer look. When I told John what I had found, he got really interested straight away. He was ready to jump in right away and start investigating further. We actually ended up taking a canoe out to where we thought it might be so we wouldn't waste air, and then went down to check it out. It wasn't long before we located it. He took a similar swim around of the thing as I did, and when we saw it again, it kind of looked like an arrowhead. If you look at pictures of an F-117 Nighthawk jet, that's roughly what it resembles, but this one was definitely more unusual in design. It wasn't flat underneath. It had this bulkier cargo area or something below the main body. John had found a huge gap in the hull beneath what looked like the left wing of the submarine. He was about to enter, but I stopped him. My air supply was running low and it was getting dark. So, we swam back up to the surface and agreed that if there was any chance we'd be able to get inside, we should switch tanks. Each of us had two. We decided it would be better to wait until morning instead. That night, I told Gary and Dave what we'd seen, and they freaked out. They were convinced that because this submarine existed in the first place, the government must be watching us, and if we entered it, we'd be dead for sure. But we eventually decided to go ahead anyway. We just pretended that the pilot was probably long gone and replaced by an alien who had assimilated into human form. Gary swam off, and the rest of us went to bed, but I barely slept at all, nor did John. The next morning, John and I went back down again. The breach in the hull was huge enough for us to slip inside one at a time. It's worth noting that the outside of the submarine looked metallic, but it was hard to say what material it was made of. What caught my attention was that the outer hull was spotless. No signs of aquatic fungus, algae, or rust anywhere. This led me to believe this might have been a recent crash, which made me really nervous. We secured a rope outside so we could follow our way out if things got complicated. When we entered the interior, it was a completely different story from what I'd expected based on the exterior. The inside was dilapidated and had all sorts of aquatic plant life, algae, and fish darting around everywhere. This place had clearly been underwater for ages. It seemed like we were in some kind of cargo area, with an open doorway at the back that looked like it might lead to an engine room. We swam over and took a look but couldn't get inside because it was blocked by rubble and pillars. So, we decided to head down a narrow corridor towards the front. We eventually came across a ladder that went up a few feet, with what appeared to be a hatch on top of it. The hatch was closed, so we examined it closely and then searched around for any clues. I spotted a lever on the side, which I signaled to John, and he told me to pull it. To our surprise, the lever triggered something mechanical, releasing air bubbles into the water, but the hatch stayed shut. We stood around for a few seconds, trying to figure out what to do next. Then John pulled out his diving knife and tried to use it to pry open one of the edges on the right side of the hatch. After a few minutes, he managed to get a small gap going, but the blade snapped off. We were able to stick our fingers in far enough to try pushing and pulling, and eventually we were able to get some movement. We swam up into what looked like the cockpit area. I saw the broken window that I had noticed from outside. John swam ahead, around a big chair that probably belonged to the pilot. As he went around it, he let out a muffled scream of shock and swam back towards me faster than I'd ever seen him swim before. His mouthpiece had fallen out, so he had to put it back in. John's eyes were wild with fear. He was trying to point at the chair and gesture like he was flying a plane, using imaginary controls. I wasn't really sure what he was doing, but then he pretended to make machine gun sounds with his mouth. It dawned on me that he thought the pilot might still be in the chair. I tried to calm him down, but I was getting scared too. I told him it was okay and we needed to take a look for ourselves. He nodded, but refused to stay put. So I went to investigate while he followed behind me. As soon as I saw that being sitting in the pilot's seat, all doubt about whether this was a UFO was gone. The creature was unlike anything human. Its head was huge compared to its body, and it had arms that were floating in the water like they were lifeless. Despite how long it must have been submerged, there was no sign of rot or decay. I made a mental note about this. I knew we needed to talk to John about getting out of here. We went back up to the surface and started brainstorming our next move. The first idea was just to leave everything behind and pretend nothing had happened. But that seemed unlikely, so we came up with some other options. One idea was to take the body back to our lab at the docks and do an autopsy. John looked at me like I was crazy. He said it wouldn't be possible to get the thing back to the States. So I shared my plan, and surprisingly, he thought maybe it could work. We carefully retrieved the body and loaded it into the canoe. I rowed back to shore while John swam alongside, but didn't want to sit in the boat with the body. As we got closer to land, I couldn't help but wonder what other surprises this day might hold. I'll never forget how upset Gary and Dave got when we got back from our encounter with whatever that was. I told them we needed to leave right away, head back to the car, and get out of there as fast as possible. They were confused at first, but then John explained what had happened down by the lake, a UFO with an alien pilot in it. Gary's eyes went white when he saw it, while Dave was fascinated. Then I started laying out our plan. We had an oversized cargo van that we used for our scientific research. There was a bench seat in the back with space underneath it, so we could stash stuff down there if needed. Our idea was to leave the body in the canoe, pack it with ice, cover it up, and then put the canoe in the back of the van instead of on the roof. It would fit because the front end would tuck under the seat. We were going to drive straight to our lab, a rented warehouse space that we used for, well, let's just say research purposes. We'd set up assignments for students or test new ideas to make sure they worked. We also had some legitimate scientific equipment there that we needed to use for our own work. Gary was freaking out and getting really agitated when he realized what could happen if we got stopped at the border. He worried that someone might find the body and we'd all be in serious trouble. Dave tried to calm him down, saying that as long as everyone stayed quiet and just did one person talk, they wouldn't have any issues. We argued about it for a while before deciding that we were going to take the body back to our lab. We packed up everything quickly and left some things behind because we didn't have time. The drive was 3 hours, but only an hour at the border. I volunteered to drive and do all the talking since I knew what to expect. Gary was a nervous wreck as we watched people get pulled over for inspection. He managed to keep his cool, though. We made it across without any problems. As soon as we were out of sight, Gary had a complete mental breakdown, but he kept his composure long enough to get us home safely. We took breaks to change the ice and make sure everything was secure in the canoe cooler. I drove cautiously because we didn't want to draw any attention. We arrived at our lab around 2:30 p.m. and quickly smuggled the body inside. We locked all the doors, drew the windows, and realized that we were at a point of no return. We were about to perform an unauthorized autopsy on an alien life form, with no idea how we'd publish our findings or what would happen next. We knew that if the government found out, we'd be in serious trouble, but by that point, we had already committed too far down this path. So, we went ahead and recorded everything on video, What we initially observed about the alien's body was that it didn't have a ribcage like humans do. Instead, it had two large bones on either side of its chest that looked similar to ribs, but its center was soft and easy to cut into. We made a deep incision to open it up, and what we found inside was fascinating. The internal organs were all there, just in different spots, making it hard to tell which ones were which, except for the lungs, which were filled with water. At this point, it became clear that the cause of death was likely drowning, as suggested by the presence of water in the lungs. There were no signs of trauma anywhere else on the body, leading us to question whether the alien had even crashed as we thought. While we had the alien open, we tried to label its organs as best we could, though it's worth noting that this was purely speculative and not entirely accurate. We did, however, identify a heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, and possibly a spleen. Next, we turned our attention to the head, where we found something remarkable. The brain structure seemed similar to ours, with multiple lobes, but it had an unusual triangular shape and what looked like a small, unknown gland near the base of the brain. We initially thought this might be related to the brain stem, but we weren't sure. That's when Dave mentioned that the gland was beating. I asked him how that could be possible since the creature was clearly dead, but upon closer inspection I noticed it too, albeit very slowly. When I touched the gland gently, I felt a pulse and saw silvery fluid leaking from it onto my glove. This substance also seemed to be circulating through the body, filling the skull cavities and down the spinal column. I took some of this fluid using a syringe and put it in a sample vial for further analysis. We had no idea what it was or where it came from at that point. As for whether it was blood, we weren't sure, but our subsequent findings would change everything. Over the next few days, we spent hours speculating about our discoveries. We barely slept and didn't call our families because we weren't due back in a few more days anyway. The next morning, however, we made a shocking discovery. The incision I had made was healing at an incredible rate, much faster than it should be considering the size of the wound. This led us to conclude that there must have been something else active on this body despite its death. We decided to test our hypothesis by injecting the mysterious substance into lab mice and see how they reacted. The results were astonishing to say the least. 3 out of 4 mice we injected appeared to be dead, but then suddenly came back to life, albeit in a pretty messed up state. They became aggressive, attacking each other and eventually cannibalizing one of their own corpses. I wanted to take a break from the experiment to say that what you're about to hear is some of the most detailed and scientifically sound thinking I've ever come across in my career. I'm completely hooked on this right now, and despite feeling like it's time to stop, I don't want to interrupt the process. We tried to kill the rabid mice by injecting them with a toxic substance. We'd done this before with other mice, but nothing seemed to work with these 3. So we doubled the dose and tried again. They should have died within seconds, but they kept acting normally. At that point, Dave took over. Dave used tongues to hold the mice in place while he pierced their skulls with a syringe. This method was effective, and the mice finally died. John suggested injecting more mice, but keeping them separate from each other. I agreed, and we injected 3 more mice with the fluid. At this point, we decided to test our hypothesis that the substance might have healing properties on dead bodies by removing an organ. We extracted more of the silvery fluid because we were worried it might affect production if we removed the gland. After we took out the gland, we made a big incision to see if the substance really did have any effect. After 8 hours, the wound hadn't healed at all, which proved our hypothesis. Whatever this fluid was, it had an incredible ability to heal damaged tissue. That's why there wasn't much trauma on the body from the crash. It must have been healed by the time it died. We also realized that this substance might not be able to bring dead bodies back to life even if they were submerged and drowned. I'm getting ahead of myself. Right after we euthanized the lab mice, we performed an autopsy on one of them. It had only been dead for 15 minutes, but its internal organs showed signs of decay that suggested it had actually been dead for several hours. Knowing this was impossible, we examined the brain and found a huge concentration of the silver fluid. We had no idea why this was happening or what it meant. We eventually came up with a hypothesis that maybe the amount of fluid in the brain kept some level of healing going despite the apparent toxicity, allowing the rest of the body to deteriorate as if the creature had expired after drowning. This seemed like a reasonable explanation given the lack of effect from the toxin and the fact it took us piercing the brain for the mouse to finally die. We did autopsies on the other 2 mice, which produced identical results. As for what happened with the other set of mice, 2 of them turned out exactly like the first 3. They died but didn't behave normally and then attacked our fingers. The 3rd mouse, however, acted differently. Long after the other 2 went rabid, this one just seemed unaffected by the injection of the fluid. We were really careful about how we handled this mouse because it wasn't showing any signs of toxicity from the substance. We weren't sure if its body had accepted the fluid and could regenerate from injuries, or if it was simply carrying the fluid without being able to recover from physical harm. That's just one possibility, that the mouse might be immune to the toxicity or have an incompatibility issue, but not actually be able to heal from injuries. It was just carrying the fluid in its body. Unfortunately, John got ahead of himself and picked up the mouse. He got bitten hard enough to break through his glove on his left thumb. The mouse then ran away, and we couldn't find it anywhere after that. We lost our only successful specimen. We told John to go to the hospital right away, but he refused. It was his fault we lost the mouse, and now he was determined to keep searching for it. We should have pushed him harder to get him help. Unfortunately, we never found the mouse. We spent most of that day speculating about our findings and brainstorming ideas. By evening, we were still going over notes and making journal entries. Around 6:30 p.m., John suddenly had a severe coughing fit. He looked pale and was sweating profusely, and it was clear he'd been bitten by the mouse. His thumb was disgusting too. As biologists, we should have known better than to ignore his condition and get him medical attention immediately. We just couldn't tear ourselves away from what we were doing. Gary offered to take John to the ER while Dave and I stayed behind. I never saw John again after that. While we were alone, Dave started talking about how we needed to test the fluid on something other than a mouse. That's when I realized we'd gone too far. We should have just left the crash site alone and definitely shouldn't have entered it. Dave was getting more and more extreme in his views, bordering on unethical. He even mentioned picking up stray animals or helping someone homeless, which made me realize we were in serious trouble. I told him there's no way any of us could be involved in something so morally questionable. He kept repeating that we needed to test the fluid on a human because maybe it would work as a cure for diseases. He became more and more obsessed with the idea, saying if it worked, we'd be creating the most powerful healing agent ever. But then he said, if it doesn't. If it didn't, we'd essentially be murderers. After a minute or so, I realized we had our own human test, John. He's showing the same symptoms as the mice did. Dave said that can't count as a true test because a bite isn't enough to transmit the fluid. A full injection is needed. I started to understand that this fluid was acting like a real disease. If it could be transferred through a bite and cause a rabid-like reaction in humans who aren't compatible, we might be facing a major outbreak. I felt like I had to call the hospital to warn them. Did you? I didn't get the chance before Gary came back saying John's condition was worsening after just 20 minutes in the car. I told him what Dave and I had discussed, and he immediately agreed we needed to stop whatever we were doing. We all went back to our living quarters and found that Dave was missing. Fearing the worst, we rushed back to the lab and found him with a tourniquet on his arm, injecting himself with a silver fluid. Gary shouted at him, "What the hell did you do?" "I've got some tough questions for you." He knew that signing his own death warrant was a no-go point, so they needed to involve the police. From what he'd seen with the mice, he wasn't optimistic about Gary's chances of survival. They sat down and discussed their next moves. Gary, being a virologist, mentioned something else. Some viruses can cause genetic mutations in the host, but not in the way people see in movies. They had to consider two things: whether this was actually a virus or just acting like one, and if it did cause a mutation, what would it even mean? I shot Gary, so he completely lost his cool, and now we're dealing with a wild situation, the narrator explained. Let's get straight to the point. I can go on about all the theories and stuff we were discussing, but it wouldn't do much good. We barely got any sleep that night because of Dave. They did some blood tests and found out that his body was reacting in a weird way, like it was writing its own genes or something. That wasn't happening with the mice, so it was pretty intriguing. But at the same time, he was getting sick really fast, pale, clammy skin, all that jazz. His decline was much slower than the other guys, though. Gary suggested tying Dave down because he was starting to lose it, and his body was changing in ways that were freaking him out, like growing at an alarming rate, and this weird claw thing happening with his hand. It was too late to take him to the hospital, so they knew things were going downhill fast. They tied him down, but we didn't think it would do much good. Unfortunately, it was all for nothing. Gary and I fell asleep, thinking maybe we could handle the situation later. But when I woke up at 6:15, something terrible had happened. Dave was dead. Gary went over to check on Dave's body, but got way too close. He told him to back off, but it was too late. Dave just lunged at him and snapped the restraints like they were made of tissue paper. And then he bit Gary pretty badly right on his shoulder. It was an accident, or so we thought, because when he broke Gary's neck, it looked like he was still super strong. I hightailed it out of there as fast as I could. Dave stood up and was now a monster, 6'5" tall, where he used to be only 5'10". I grabbed the gun from the living room, just in case we needed it some night when we were hanging around late at the docks. I was hiding behind the desk with the lights off, trying to be silent. I could hear Dave's heavy footsteps outside, and his labored breathing made it sound like a chainsaw. He must have known exactly where I was because he stopped right in front of me as soon as he entered the room. The question on my mind was whether his heightened senses would allow him to detect me or even smell me. As he stood there, holding the desk aloft with one arm, it looked like a scene straight out of a bad action movie. I decided to make a break for it by crawling behind him and running as fast as I could. The sound of the desk crashing into the wall behind me was deafening. Panic set in when I realized that if Dave got away, he'd likely infect more people. I reluctantly returned to our lab, knowing I had no choice but to stop him before he caused any more harm. With a steady hand, I fired all 7 shots at his head, ending the threat once and for all. However, as I entered the lab, I saw Dave wind up and punch a hole through the wall. He stepped out into the sunlight and made his way towards the marina. As I followed him, I yelled Dave at the top of my lungs to get everyone's attention. The early morning crowd on the docks turned around to see me approaching him. In a split second, he growled menacingly and spun around. His outburst caught everyone's attention, and they all backed away in fear. This is when I saw my chance and took it by shooting 2 shots into his face. He stumbled back before collapsing from the headshots. The screams of bystanders filled the air as people scrambled to get away. I was running on adrenaline, feeling completely out of control myself. As I sprinted back into the lab, I found Gary had been bitten, and we needed to act fast. With shaking hands, I shot 2 more bullets into his head, putting an end to him too. After the chaos died down, I collapsed in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Then I heard footsteps behind me and someone yelling, "Get on the ground now." As I hit the floor, everything went black. I couldn't help but feel that he was telling the truth about not knowing anything about the lab or John. He seemed educated, but also street smart, which made me think that once this got out, the government would be all over him and try to silence him. And boy, was he right. Just a couple of days later, I received a visit from the FBI, telling me my services were no longer needed in the case, and asking for all materials related to it. Later on, I got another call from the station, this time with men in suits asking me to hand over the tape. However, since I'd already backed it up elsewhere, I wasn't too fussed about it. When I asked around about what was going to happen next, everyone told me that they too had been reassigned and that the case was being handled externally. I decided to do some digging of my own. First, I went to check out the lab at one of the warehouses near the docks. It had been over a week since the incident, but even then, people in hazmat suits were still entering and exiting the building. They'd essentially locked it down completely. My next stop was the hospital. I know some doctors from there, so I reached out to them for information. The emergency room doc confirmed that he'd never seen anything like what happened to John before. They quickly got him upstairs to talk to a colleague who owed them a favor. They made sure our conversation couldn't be traced. The ER doc told me that John passed away shortly after being admitted. He had pronounced John dead himself, but when the medical team went to bag his body up, something strange happened. As soon as they did, John started thrashing around and making a lot of noise. He was stone cold dead. A nurse aide tried to open the bag but got bitten in the process, so security was called and eventually the cops were involved too. Apparently, one security guard lost it when he saw John's body and ended up hitting another employee over the head with an oxygen tank, which apparently killed him. Later on, the aide quit without explanation and just disappeared. Her email resignation still sitting in the system. The ER doc also told me that someone high up at the hospital deleted John's electronic medical record entirely. I then went to where they said they'd taken their boat, but when I got there, it was heavily guarded and had no trespassing signs everywhere. It even warned people that intruders might get shot. The whole thing is really unsettling, so I'm hoping no one's been paying too much attention to me while I tell this story. As for Michael, I never heard from him again after the incident, not a single word. When I checked his background records, everything seemed to have been erased or deleted. His social media accounts are gone too, but if you try looking up similar names online, that's all you get back. It seems like they blackbagged him and the other 3. Looking at this whole thing, it's pretty suspicious. It feels like a conspiracy, especially since Michael said exactly what happened. There's one weird part that keeps bothering me though, that missing mouse. Did some government agency find it at the marina, or did they just leave something behind? It seems like these kinds of events often start with animal carriers in the past. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.